Here we go. Episode 2 of the iGaming experience is underway. I'm Sam Bhatti, and I'm here at the beautiful Zebra Studios here in Podgorica, Montenegro. And I'm here to teach you a thing or two about iGaming and learn a thing or two about iGaming. So I imagine if you're listening to this, you took the 7 minutes that it would take to listen to the first episode, which was a little bit of an intro into the pod. But for those of you that haven't done it, just to give you a little bit of a primer, the whole point of this podcast is to educate you, the listener, and to educate me as the host to get a better understanding of iGaming, how this industry works, and how we can all improve at our jobs, assuming that most of you are actually working in this industry. And if you're not, maybe just giving you an insight. Maybe you're curious about it. Maybe you're a player and you want to know what it's like on the other side. So this podcast is here to pull back the curtain and give everyone an idea of what ingredients go into make this beautiful dish that we call iGaming. And so I had given a little bit of an intro to myself before. I'll recap that now really quickly. Basically, my entire career has been mainly in technology development. I had a little bit of a diversion into marketing, and then sort of came back into the fold and combined my skills of tech and marketing and design, and sort of for the last few jobs I've had, I've kind of held a dual CTO, CMO role or something along those lines. I had a tech, I had a marketing type of position. And before iGaming, I was mainly focused on fintech and e-commerce. And I had gotten used to those systems and the different complexities that went into developing those platforms. And quite frankly, I was expecting when I came into iGaming that it was going to be a whole lot easier. The sites look a little bit cartoonish, and it looked like it was going to be a fairly simple lift for me to wrap my head around how this all works, what are the different components that plug in to make an iGaming site, and jump off and be off to the races from there. But that wasn't really the case. I was surprised when I first got into an iGaming company as a head of technology that the technology was quite complex, and there was a lot of jargon and a lot of things that I had to learn. And I was quite fortunate that I was connected with good colleagues and people that were willing to share. But that's not always the case. And I don't know about everyone's situation, but I'm sure that a lot of you are finding it difficult to get information and to get the inside information, let's just say, not even inside information, just the basic information on how this all works and how it all comes together. And I think I could even say from experience that there's probably a lot of points in meetings when you're sitting there and you're not exactly sure what people are talking about. So I'm going to try and demystify a lot of these things here in this podcast, and then also have some of these things demystified for me. So in this episode, I probably should have got to this a lot earlier. Bear with me. This is episode number 2. But the main purpose of this episode is to give you an overview of how iGaming platforms work. So mainly from a technology perspective, what is required to actually have an online sportsbook and casino. Okay, so we're going to break down a couple of things that I think for some people are going to be really obvious, or things that you've just known for years and years. But I'm hoping that for a lot of you, you're going to have some aha moments, and you're going to say, okay, great, I've heard that term a bunch of times, and I thought I knew what it meant, but Sam's just given me a little bit more clearer of an idea of what exactly that is and how it fits into the grand scheme of things. So in a nutshell, let me just scroll through my note here. We're going to be going through a couple of things. The front end, which you've probably heard before, or not, don't worry. It's fine if you haven't heard any of these terms. Then we're going to talk about the back end, and then we'll talk about some key integrations. And if there's any time, I might dive into a couple of other nuances within those sections. But I think that we'll have enough to go over just on the basics. In future episodes, in pretty much everything that I mention here, we're going to be diving much deeper into it and getting some real details, but not from me. I'm going to be bringing in proper experts that will, that have domain expertise in specific niches of iGaming, And so we'll be getting you the nitty gritty. But for now, it's mainly to give you a general overview. And also to iron it out for myself, because hey, if I get some of this wrong, then I want to hear about it as well. And you guys can give me your perspective if there's some proper experts listening to this. Right. So why don't we start with the front end? Because that is the one, the part of these sites that people are most familiar with. Everyone gets to see it, from the players to the operators, to the regulars, to whoever has an interest in looking at these sites. This is what everyone gets to see without needing special access. So the front end is very simply what the player sees, what the website actually is, what it looks like. All right. So when someone goes to your domain name and types it in, what is shown on their screen? That is what is generally referred to as the front end. Okay. So the front end is absolutely critical for the success of your platform, obviously, but we don't even need to get into that part now. Really, I'm just trying to explain to you what it actually is. So I would say the place to start with that would be another set of letters or jargon that you've probably come across at some point in your life as well, the UI and the UX. All right, so that stands for the user interface and the user experience. So in very simple terms, what's it like to use the site? What's the journey like? Where are the buttons? Is it intuitive? Is it pleasing to the eye? Is it something that a player wants to look at, for hours and hours on end? What's the overall flow? Is it easy? Do players get confused? Do they know where to find different features? Is it obvious how to jump from one place to another? And in fact, as I'm talking about this now, I'm thinking of two guests that I really want to have on that are UI, UX experts that will be able to break this down much better than I can. But the idea here is this is your general design for the site. So when people are referring to the front end, that's what we're talking about. Okay, and I'll circle back to this later on. But let's move on to the next major component of any website really, but particularly an iGaming site, and that would be the back end. So if the front end is what the players see, or what the general public sees, the back end is what the operators see. Okay, so the back end is kind of like the engine of the website. This is where all the power comes from. This is where all the information flows in and out of. And what you're seeing on the front end is just a display of what's living in the back end. The information in there, the data that's in there, and depending on your developers and how things are set up, it's configured to push information out or pull information out depending on, again, which side you're coming from. So when I have a proper developer on here, not me, we can get into those details a little bit more. But for now, I'll just give you a general breakdown of the back end. You're basically looking at the PAM, which stands for the player account management. You're looking at usually like a bonus engine, promotion engine, different tools for risk and fraud detection, a CRM, right, which can also fall under the PAM. So CRM stands for customer relationship management. And then sometimes this is sitting separately, there's also a thing called the CMS, which is the content management system. And I realize I probably should have gone a little bit slower with that, so let me rewind a little bit, because this I found has confused people, not just in iGaming, but a lot of different industries. So I'll go slower here. CRM, customer relationship management, that's where you will have all the data about your players. So when someone signs up, when they do KYC, when they take any type of action on the site that gets recorded, that's going to show up in the CRM, right? So you can, if I've signed up to a site, Sam Bhatti, and I've gone in there, done a bunch of gameplay, and I've submitted my documentation, proof of address, and proof of my age, then as an operator, if I want to look up Sam, then you go into the CRM, and that's typically where you're going to find all the information about the specific player that you're looking for. Okay, so CRM, customer relationship management. The CMS, right? Similar letters, but different. CMS, content management system. Okay, and very simply, The way that I would describe a content management system is it's a way for people that aren't the developers to control what you see on the front end. So it's a way to change out the banners, some of the promotional graphics, possibly even some of the icons, some of the text that you see on screen. And a lot of that will depend on the platform that you're using and how they've built the CMS. Is it accessible to the operator? Do you only have to go through developers? And then, within that CMS, how deep is it? What can you actually control? Can you change the language? Can you only change the banners on the home page? Some of them will allow you to change the tiles on the game screens. So a lot of nuances there. And, we'll probably have a specific episode on each one of those things. I can see us having a CRM episode and a CMS episode, maybe even multiple, just to dive into it deeper. And we'll get a couple of real experts on here that'll be able to just go on and, wax poetic for hours and hours about the nuances, the different features, what makes one good versus another. So that's essentially your back office. And again, I'm going to dive back into it. This is just a little bit. I'm just going to list them out to you and then come back to it. So a couple of other things that I just want to mention before we get a little bit deeper into it is a few key integrations. So obviously we're talking about an online sportsbook and casino. So you need to have the sportsbook and you need to have the casino, right? So these are key integrations. So your sportsbook is, at least the feed itself is coming from a third party. Sometimes what you see on the screen, the front end, is controlled by the sportsbook provider, and that's what's called an iframe. Just take a note of that. I'm not going to explain iframes now, but we'll get into that later on when we talk about probably some other tools that would go on these sites again in a future episode. But yeah, so you've got your sportsbook. You would pick one of the larger providers out there, the Sport Radars or BetB or BetConstruct. There's a ton of companies out there that have their own sportsbook. You can take their front end. In some cases, you can customize your own front end and just pull the feed into it. But that is a key integration in most sites. And in fact, I should say that's, in my experience, sort of been the trend now. Is initially there was plenty of sites that were just casino only, but it sort of feels like nowadays people are leaning towards having both, regardless of what the main demographic is for that site. So even if you've got 99% casino players, a lot of operators are feeling like it's a lighter lift these days to add a sportsbook to the site, so people are looking to do that. All right, so that's sportsbook, at a glance. And then also at a glance is your casino. So the casino is made up of games, right? Table games, crash games, live games, all different types. And those games are being sent to you, or you're able to pull them from different game providers. So in some cases, these are direct feeds or direct integrations. So if Evolution is making a game and I want that game on my site, then I can potentially go to Evolution, and if we can reach an agreement, then I'll be able to work with their development team, and we can do a direct integration with their tech onto our platform, and then be able to pull in the Evolution games. So that's one route. The easier route, which I don't really have numbers on this, but I assume most operators are doing, is using an aggregator. Something like Every Matrix, Soft Swiss, Hub 88. These are examples of some of the more popular ones. And what they will do is they've already went out to all these different game studios and got agreements with them, and so all of the games feed into your platform, and basically through one integration you can get thousands of games and dozens of game studios onto your site. So those are two major integrations. You got your sportsbook, you've got your casino. A third one, which is huge, is your payment gateways, right? So the players have to be able to actually send money to your site, play it, and then withdraw. And it hasn't changed in that with regular money, right? Which is if you're not a crypto head, regular money is referred to as fiat in the crypto world. If you're taking fiat payments only, then it's very important that you're aware of what regions and what markets you're trying to serve. So, for example, if you're going for a Canadian market, then their number one electronic payment method is called Interact. So you need to integrate a payment system on your platform that would be able to take Interact. And in fact, I should rewind a little bit. A little bit of jargon that people will use in the industry is PSPs. So PSPs stands for Payment Service Providers. And so you're going to these PSPs, and they're being integrated into your site. So you've got the fiat side, and there's a whole world of I just mentioned one about Canada, but every geo pretty much has its own specific preferred payment method. And if you want to be successful in those markets, then you want to have this super popular method. So I said Interact in Canada. I think in Brazil there's one called Pix, and so on. The list is very long, and in fact I happen to have a fantastic expert in payments that I will have on a future episode, and we can really get into that and break it all down so that we all have a great understanding of it, because mine is a little bit on the surface level as well. So I'd like to get a little bit more into that topic of how payments work and how they flow. And as I was about to get into, there's a whole other world on the crypto side as well. So you've got your fiat PSPs, and then you have your crypto PSPs. And I don't know of a case where you can get both from just one third-party service. I don't think that exists. I would love to be corrected on that. It would be great if there's a one-stop shop. But typically, you're going to want to integrate a crypto PSP separately to your fiat PSPs. And usually, I think you can get away with one integration for a crypto PSP. I think some platforms might be wanting to use 2 or 3 for a fallback. And very briefly on that, this isn't an episode on PSPs or crypto PSPs, but very simply, the way that tends to work is you have a crypto payment service provider integrated on your site. So when a player joins and wants to make a deposit, let's say they want to deposit Bitcoin, a Bitcoin wallet is created for that specific user. It doesn't always work this way, right? I'm just giving you an example of how it sometimes works. A wallet is created for that user, and if they want to make a deposit, then they are just given a wallet address, or the address of that wallet that belongs to them, and they just go to their crypto exchange or wherever they're holding their Bitcoin, and they send it to that wallet. And as soon as the blockchain confirms it, then they'll see that in their balance, and they can go ahead and play. And so this is what we would call a wallet-to-wallet service, right? They had Bitcoin sitting in one wallet. We've created a wallet for them on the platform, and they've just sent it wallet to wallet. And then if they want to withdraw, it's the same process, but the other way. So they're going to initiate a withdrawal, and the platform, the crypto payment service provider is going to send that back to the wallet that it came from in most cases. All right, so I might have digressed a little bit there on payment gateways, but probably an important subject for us to dive into a little bit deeper down the road as well. And then the last thing, as far as key integrations that I've identified, is compliance and KYC tools. So, again, I'm using some jargon here. I think I used this earlier in the episode and didn't explain it. So KYC stands for Know Your Customer. And that is just an industry term, not just in iGaming, but in most industries where you have to verify someone's identity. This is called KYC, right? A little bit of a side note, there's several KYs. One of them is KYB, Know Your Business. So if you're trying to get a contract for your business, then sometimes you have to go through a KYB process and submit all the relevant documentation for your business. But right now we're talking about KYC, which is submitting the information that you would need to be able to prove to these gaming platforms that you are who you say you are, and you can legally gamble on their site. So there are a few different tools that will do your KYC automatically, or in some cases, if you have your own proprietary platform, then you may be handling the KYC yourself. All right, and so that is not really a process that I'm very familiar with. I am on, going through the automated KYC, but as far as doing it yourself, that's also going to be something I'm going to get an expert on, and we can dive into that a little bit deeper down the road. So that is basically your iGaming platform in a nutshell. I don't think that I missed any major components. If I did, feel free to comment and let me know, and I'll certainly address that. As I said, this is also about me learning. So, this isn't a gotcha moment. Just feel free to educate me, right? Okay, so in fact, sorry, I missed something important here. Something else that I wanted to break down. I wouldn't say I missed it, but this is just an important thing to throw in. So I'd mentioned the front end, what everyone sees, and I mentioned the back end, which is what the operator sees, and it's like the engine that feeds the front end. So how do they feed each other, right? Where is the connection there? So in a lot of cases, the back office and we don't need to get into the whole technology of this right now, because again, I'm not some hotshot developer, and I've got a couple of hotshot developers. In fact, one sitting right over my shoulder here, that I'll bring in on future episodes to break that down. But generally, you're looking at the use of something called an API, right? So you got front end, you got back end, and then in the middle, very often referred to as like a type of digital bridge, is an API, right? And so all an API does is it provides an outlet for the back office to send information to the front end. And it's really just like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the best analogy. Maybe like, I guess bridge is really good, or like a translator. So it'll take stuff from here, and along the way, it might change it to be something a little bit more palatable, I guess, or easier to read for the front end, and then it'll put that out there. And in fact, for a lot of these integrations that I'm talking about, it's done via API. So if I'm going to a game studio and I'm wanting to integrate their feed into my platform, that would be, in most cases, looking at the API documentation that they've got and trying to and then developing it so that it plugs into ours. And there is levels of standardization here. Again, I don't want to embarrass myself by trying to explain all that, so I'll bring other people on that will give us a more in-depth look at how exactly that works and why that's so important. But on a more basic term, I guess I could talk about the importance of that, because in the sense that, and this is something that everyone can relate to, is if that is done well, if that's done efficiently and with clean code, it has a big impact on performance. So is the site loading fast? Is it glitching? Is it loading things correctly? Are there any errors popping up that shouldn't be? And I think this isn't really something that you need to be a developer or into marketing or anything to understand that the faster and smoother your website works, the better it's going to perform as a tool to make some money. Right? People are going to want to spend more time on your site if it works cleanly, and that there's not a bunch of times that they have to refresh it, or if they're feeling like there's bugs in there, or the some of the information didn't actually land. Say they placed a bet and then they're not able to find it. These types of things are the really like the. I was about to say a fine line, but it's not even a fine line. It's a very clear line between success and failure, right? And in fact, when I get my UI expert on here, I'm going to break this down a little bit, because I think people would be shocked at just how small the margins are here, right? If your site is just a little bit slow, like I'm talking like half a second slow, and half a second in web development terms is massive, actually, but for regular human beings, half a second seems like a short amount of time. But if you're constantly being delayed half a second in 2025, it's just not acceptable. People are going to move on. Whether you're conscious of it or not, you're going to say, I'm not dealing with this. I'm going to go to something that's going to be a little bit faster. Which is one of the reasons why it's so important to have developers that understand this industry as well. And so that's a whole other rabbit hole that I'm looking forward to going down about experience in this industry and how it helps. And in fact, this podcast is here to sort of mitigate that a little bit, so that people that don't have as much hands-on experience can still get some of the knowledge that people do derive from getting their hands dirty and getting into this iGaming industry and really trying to make things happen. Okay, let me check back on my notes here. I just want to see if there's anything else major that I didn't touch on. Okay, yeah, a little bit here. So your front end, right? When you're a provider of this technology, right, and a client comes to you and says, hey, I want to have an online sportsbook and casino, there's usually a couple of options. Number one is that operator would have developed several templates, right? And so a template is just basically a pre-designed website with fairly rigid components. And if someone wants to come along and they want a new site and they're happy to use one of those templates, then we would do something that's called reskinning, where you're just basically changing the colors, you're adding their logo, maybe a couple of small tweaks here and there, and basically out of the box, you can offer someone a site. Right, here you go, boom, you've seen this. A couple of slight drawbacks to that is that your site might wind up looking exactly like someone else's site, right? Depending on what level of customization they chose. If I offered this template to the operator before you and they chose it, and you guys are both just changing the logos and a couple of colors, then if people happen to land on both of your sites, it's going to look exactly the same. How good or bad that is, again, that's something I'll leave to another discussion once I have some guests on here. But it is for me, it is something that stands out a lot, and maybe because I'm so in the weeds in this industry, both as working in it and also as a user. So I am always looking for a unique, fresh look, which brings me to the second option that a new operator might have, which is a custom design. So not in every case, but in a lot of cases, technology providers, platform providers, such as a great company like maybe Zebra Solutions, they would be able to offer you a fully custom front end if you so chose. So there's an additional cost there, but that's where you could come in with your own design, or you could engage in-house designers of the operator as well and say, listen, I want my homepage to look completely different, or I want this component from the homepage to be here on the game summary page or the casino lobby page. And those things can all be done, right? It can all be done for a price. And so that will very much, again, depend on the amount of customization, the studio that you're dealing with, where they are, all these different factors. But just know that that's completely an option as well. Like in technology, pretty much anything can be done for a price. But normally, this is what's being offered on hand is the idea of a template, slight tweaks to the template, or a full-blown customization. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll just spell it out, that if you're to go with the template option, the cost is going to be significantly lower than if you're going to go with the custom front end. Okay. I think that's mainly what I wanted to hit. I guess the last thing that I'll underscore here. I know I went on a little bit about CRM and CMS, but one thing I didn't talk that much about was what's referred to as the PAM, Player Account Management. So again, there's a bit of a gray area there, whether that's just a standalone CRM or if there's some other tools in there that allow you to manage the account of the player. And that's something that maybe I'll have a little back and forth with some other operators and see how they like to call it. But I feel like PAM is a good blanket term where if you're in the industry, people at least have a general idea of what area that you're talking about. And so I just kind of wanted to make that clear that like PAM and CRM are not interchangeable. Right. In my mind, a CRM is like PAM is kind of the blanket term, and then a CRM would be like a major component of it, which in some cases could make up the entire thing, but in other cases there are other things that you would add in there to to fill that out and to be able to properly manage your player and keep them around and retain them, which is also going to be a future episode that maybe even a series actually, because one of the biggest issues in iGaming really is not getting players to your site. I mean, that's also a challenge, but it's keeping them. Once you've spent all this money to get them on there, retention can be challenging, and there's a lot that can be done to make your site a little bit more enticing than the next one. So again, we'll have a nice deep dive into that as well at some point very soon. Not sure what episode we're going to hit that. And just a final glance, I want to see if there's anything else I wanted to touch on. Not really. I did have a couple of other ideas here, but I think we're going to run a little bit long for a solo episode, so I might just cut it short here. But in the future, if you're wondering, we're going to be getting a little bit more granular about each one of these sections. So like when I mentioned sportsbook and that there's different providers, like which providers are out there? What's the major difference between them? What features should you be looking for to make your sportsbook stand out a little bit? And I have some decent insights on that as well, just because I also like to place a bet or two, on these different platforms. So I know what I like to look at from both sides, from the provider of this technology and then also the consumer of this technology. Also, we'll break into casino games, casino studios, and just give you a lay of the land there. Like what are the big guys out there? What are the major players? What are the up and coming ones? What are the big aggregators, and what's sort of the difference between those? So yeah, look forward to that. And then another thing which I was going to get into on this one, but again I think it's just too much of a topic, is white label versus turnkey, which is I've found in iGaming to sort of be very specific to iGaming in the way that that's defined. So we will hit that in a future episode. But I think for now, that's going to be it for episode 2. That's me dropping some knowledge on the very general technology perspective of iGaming and how a platform typically works. There will be a part 2, 3, 4, and 5, I'm sure, to this episode where we'll get even deeper and deeper and really get an intimate understanding of how this all comes together to build these really cool platforms that we're all so fired up about. And that's it for now. So thanks for checking it out. This has been episode 2. I'm Sam Bhatti, again here at the Zebra Studios in Podgorica, Montenegro. And catch us every Friday. These episodes are dropping. This is only the second one, so momentum is building. Drop us a comment. Let me know what you want to see. If this isn't the vibe that you're looking for, then kind of too bad. Actually, this is my vibe. But always happy for some suggestions and some constructive criticism. Look how we can improve the show. It's a new one, but I have a pretty clear idea of how I want this to go. I wanted to keep it a little bit casual, but at the same time informative and a little bit different maybe from the more produced iGaming podcasts out there, which are great. I consume all of them. There's only 3 or 4 other ones out there, but just trying to give you guys all a different vibe here. So some feedback would be cool. And, thanks everyone for checking it out, and look forward to talking to you next Friday. Ciao.